The leader of the Wagner mercenary group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, has apparently left Russia after the failure of his march for justice against Moscow. What are the implications of his departure for the war in Ukraine? The Wagner Group has been incredibly important for President Putin. It's delivered success on the battlefield where the Russian army has failed to do so. Classically in Bakhmut, where Yevgeny Prigozhin's Wagner Group made huge progress and eventually took Bakhmut after months of fighting, delivering a rare success for President Putin. But during that time, frictions between the Wagner Group and the regular Russian army emerged. It was quite clear the Russian army was trying to starve the mercenary group of ammunition and also not protecting its flanks properly. That tension between Yevgeny Prigozhin, the boss of the Wagner Group, and the boss of the army, Gerasimov, and the Defense Secretary, Russian Defense Secretary Sergei Shoigu, manifested itself eventually in an effort to try to bring the Wagner Group under the direct control of the Russian MOD. And a deadline was put for the 1st of July for the Wagner Group to sign up to the Russian MOD. This angered Yevgeny Prigozhin, almost certainly led him to march this march for justice against Moscow. Not necessarily trying to unseat Putin, but almost certainly trying to unseat Gerasimov and Shoigu. Now, President Putin would have watched all this from afar, and his allegiance would either be with Prigozhin or with his established military leaders. It turned out to be the latter. He went on national television, spoke very angrily of the stab in the back that Yevgeny Prigozhin had delivered to him, and that seems to have marked the end of this particular opposition against Moscow. In the short term, it will have very limited impact on the war in Ukraine. Most of the soldiers, Russian soldiers, will be pointing their rifles at the Ukrainian enemy and will just be scared at what's going to come next. But what's most interesting, I think, is President Putin will have been rattled by what has happened. Almost certainly his number one priority is seizing and holding power.
The most important thing is that Putin is weakened. So it's like the spiders in a jar. The one who will get out of it will be wounded and weakened.
Moscow will probably need to withdraw some forces out of Ukraine to bolster the defences on his domestic front, and that will inevitably reduce the reserves available for the Russian forces in Ukraine. The other big important thing is that President Putin has leaned heavily on mercenary groups to help deliver success. But of course now they've become a threat to him. So it's almost certain that we'll see reduced impact of mercenary groups. Although, to be fair, as we saw in Sudan, if you try to assimilate a serving military and a rebel group, you end up with civil war. That may still erupt for President Putin. But in the near term, it'll be morale. The morale of the Russian forces will have been impacted adversely by this. They will have seen the chaos in their headquarters, the undermining of Putin's authority. That will not be good for their morale. And therefore, by the same token, Ukrainian morale will be heightened by this. But in the near term, we'll probably see very limited difference on the battlefield. In the near term, Ukraine will be focused on its counteroffensive. At the moment, they're not committing their main forces. They're probing the Russian defences to try to find a way through, a sign of weakness. And that's when we'll see the main Ukrainian forces committed to the fight. Now, in the near term, Russian defences are pretty well established, and it will be quite difficult for Ukraine to break through. What we are going to see, though, is almost certainly the Russians have not got the reserve forces that they once had, and their morale will be at a lower level as a result. When Ukraine does make a breakthrough, it could have significant consequences for the long-term impact of the war, and also potentially any breakthrough, it could actually undermine Russian morale completely, and we could see a rout. But that's all to come. Ukrainians have got to make a breakthrough first. In the near term, we can expect the war to continue exactly as it's progressing at the moment, with the Ukrainians desperate for a breakthrough and the Russians fighting their defensive lines. What's interesting that's been thrown up as a result of this is whether President Putin is secure in the long term. Undoubtedly he's been damaged in the near term, but whether this unseats him from power remains to be seen, and it's very unlikely. He will fight very hard, tooth and nail, to remain in power.
You see, when you have a one-man dictatorship, uneasy is the head that wears the crown. And he requires, for his continuing power, he can't defend himself. He needs to have the army. He needs to have the intelligence agencies, some of the oligarchs who have protected and defended him up till now. They have to be willing to continue to do so. Now, these are all tough people. These are all people who are looking to their own position, and they know that Putin is no longer a good investment. And therefore, they will be already talking amongst themselves, perhaps very privately, not near any microphones. Is this guy now a complete liability? Should we perhaps go and persuade him time to retire to his country dacha and let somebody else take over?
The other interesting aspect is Belarus's involvement. If it's true that President Lukashenko brokered the deal that just persuaded Yevgeny Prigozhin not to march, to halt his march on Moscow and to go into Belarus, that will be a fascinating dynamic. Some Machiavellian view is that maybe Lukashenko is providing a safe haven for Prigozhin so that he can mount an offence on Kyiv at some stage in the future. To be brutally honest though, if Putin wanted to do that, there are much easier ways for him to move Prigozhin into Belarus under the radar without all the fanfare and also without all the damage that has been caused to President Putin along the way. From Lukashenko's perspective, almost certainly this has been a positive thing as well. He's been somewhat subjugated to President Putin over the last few years. This was an opportunity for him to help President Putin in his hour of need. It also gave Prigozhin a way out of the really difficult situation he had found himself in.